He stormed into the office, seething with rage. Fired? Him? John Randolph clenched his fists, ready to demand an explanation. But the moment he saw who was sitting behind the desk, his face went pale. His eyes darted to the woman in front of him, the same one he had refused to drive yesterday. It was you? His voice cracked. Lena slowly tilted her head, her gaze icy. Welcome to the real world, Mr. Randolph. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of the worst day of his life. Lena Brooks stood at the edge of the sidewalk, her hands tucked into the pockets of her elegant wool coat. The air smelled of damp asphalt, and the evening chill seeped into her bones. She glanced at her phone. Time was running out. Tonight was a crucial meeting. Her company was on the verge of closing a deal that would take her business to the federal level. Everything was planned down to the minute. Get to the city center, finalize preparations, negotiations. She raised her hand and hailed a taxi. The car screeched to a stop by the curb. The driver, a man in his 50s, lazily glanced at her. Graying temples, a slight paunch, the weary look of someone who had long grown tired of his job and people in general. Lena stepped forward to open the door, but before she could, she heard it. No. She froze. What? The driver frowned, looked her straight in the eye, and stated, as if she had somehow insulted him, I'm not taking you. Lena blinked in confusion. Excuse me, but why? Find someone else. He snorted, shrugged indifferently, and shut the door right in her face. A second later, the car sped off, leaving behind only the sharp scent of exhaust fumes. Lena stood motionless on the sidewalk. It took her a moment to even process what had just happened. People walked by. The city carried on as usual. No one paid attention to the fact that a grown woman had just been rejected for no reason at all. She swallowed hard. How many times had she heard stories like this? How many times had people told her, You're imagining things. This doesn't happen anymore. It's not like it used to be. But there it was, right in front of her. No excuses, no pretense, just refusal. Lena exhaled slowly, feeling something cold rise within her. Not anger, not outrage, but a calm, precise realization. That man had no idea who he had just turned away. But very soon, he would. Lena Brooks sat in the back seat of the rideshare car, staring out the window. Her fingers gripped her phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The city lights flashed by. People hurried about their business, oblivious to the ice-cold storm brewing inside her. She could still see his face. That look. That arrogant, tired, dismissive look he gave her before driving away. As if he had the right. As if she was supposed to accept it. Her jaw clenched as she forced herself to breathe evenly. Everything okay? The driver asked cautiously, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. Lena blinked, shoving her emotions aside. Yes, thank you. But that was a lie. She couldn't let this go. That man had no idea who he had refused to drive. The office was nearly empty when Lena walked in. Awards hung on the walls. Documents lay neatly on desks. In the offices, people worked, people she had personally hired. She stepped into the reception area and nodded to her assistant, Kim. Find me a file on John Randolph, she said in an even voice. Kim hesitated. I'm sorry. Who? John Randolph, a taxi driver in our fleet. I want everything, his work hours, complaints, employment history. Every last detail. The assistant hesitated. Is this a special case? Lena met her gaze directly. A very special one. Kim understood there was no point in arguing and gave a small nod. Lena turned and walked into her office, closing the door behind her. She didn't just want to fire this man. She wanted him to remember this day forever. She wanted him to realize his mistake, not when he saw his termination notice. No, when he understood exactly who had fired him. That morning, Lena sat in her spacious office, staring at the open documents in front of her. On her computer screen, John Randolph's personnel file, 7 years with the company, multiple warnings for rudeness, customer complaints about discriminatory behavior. Passengers had reported that he refused to pick up certain people, yet he had always managed to avoid consequences. That would change today. Lena clasped her hands on the desk and looked at Victoria, the head of HR, who was nervously fidgeting with her pen. "Lena, are you sure?" Victoria asked, glancing at the papers. "He's been here a long time. His performance is stable." Lena slowly lifted her gaze. "Are you defending him?" Victoria flushed. "No, this might raise some questions." Lena let out a quiet laugh. "Questions? Are you telling me that if this man had refused to pick up a white man in a suit even once, he'd still have a job?" Silence. Lena's voice turned to steel. "This man has repeatedly violated company policy. He discriminates against customers based on their race. He tarnishes our brand and believes he can decide who deserves service and who doesn't." Victoria looked away. "Prepare the paperwork," Lena said calmly. "He's fired, effective immediately." An hour later, an outraged voice echoed through the reception area. "I demand to speak to management." Lena didn't even glance up from her monitor. "Send him in," she told her assistant. The door burst open. John Randolph stormed in. He looked like someone had doused him in boiling water. His face was red, his lips trembling with indignation. "What the hell is this? I'm fired?" Lena slowly lifted her eyes. "Sit down." He opened his mouth to argue, but something in her calm, authoritative tone made him hesitate. He sat. Lena interlaced her fingers and studied him as if he were a meaningless object cluttering her desk. "Do you remember last night?" she asked evenly. John frowned. "What night?" "Your shift, your last passenger, or rather the person you refused to pick up." For a split second, recognition flickered in his eyes. He looked at her more closely, froze, and Lena saw the exact moment, the moment when he realized. He recognized her. It was you?" His voice was hoarse. Lena smiled. There was no warmth in it. "Yes." He swallowed, understanding that he had just destroyed his own career with his own hands. But she wasn't done. Lena leaned forward, her voice turning glacial. "You worked here for 7 years, Mr. Randolph. 7 years. And in that time, you allowed yourself to decide who was worthy of your service and who wasn't." He opened his mouth to protest, but she raised a hand, silencing him. "The company I own has no place for people who believe they can behave however they please." She slid the termination papers across the desk. "Sign." John's hands trembled. He had lost, and he knew it. John Randolph sat in silence. Fear, anger, and the crushing weight of defeat twisted his face. His fists clenched. His lips trembled with suppressed rage. In front of him lay the termination document. Lena sat across from him, leaning back in her chair, legs crossed, watching him without a hint of sympathy. This moment, her moment. "Sign it," she repeated, firmer this time. John swallowed hard. This can't be real," he exhaled, shifting his gaze from the paper to her. I worked here for 7 years. Lena smirked. 7 years of believing you had the right to choose who deserved service and who didn't. She leaned forward, her gaze sharp as a blade. "You didn't even realize who you turned away last night, did you?" He didn't answer. She tilted her head slightly, savoring the moment. "You didn't even give me a chance." Just looked at me and decided I wasn't worth stepping into your car. John swallowed. I didn't mean. But you did. He looked back down at the document, inhaled, exhaled, picked up the pen. Lena saw how much it cost him to make that movement, how rage boiled inside him, how desperately he wanted to justify himself, to accuse her of seeking revenge. But he couldn't, because he knew. He had done this to himself. Ink met paper. John set the pen down, his teeth clenched. He had just signed his own downfall. Lena picked up the document, glanced at the signature, then carefully folded it and placed it into the folder. "That's all, Mr. Randolph," she said calmly. "You're free to go." He shot up from his seat, fists still clenched. This is all because of last night? You're serious?" Lena looked up at him, her composure more terrifying than any scream. "Did you seriously think there wouldn't be consequences?" John opened his mouth, then closed it. He knew. It was over. He didn't even have time to bury his face in his hands in realization of his downfall before the security guard at the door stepped forward. "Allow me to escort you, sir," came the even voice. John turned to Lena, hatred burning in his eyes. She smiled, softly, calmly. This was the end. He turned and walked out. His heavy footsteps faded down the hallway, growing quieter and quieter until they disappeared completely. Lena took a deep breath. Silence filled the room, and only now did she allow herself to fully enjoy the moment. She felt no anger, no hatred, only complete satisfaction. She was no longer the girl who could be dismissed. She was no longer someone to be ignored. She owned this game now.